My mother was born in 1931 in England, south of London, a little village called Sittingbourne in Kent. And she came of age. She was 18 years old in 1949, so much of her life was spent during World War II. She was an evacuee. So in 1949, at the age of 18, her father had said that she shouldn't go to college. Women should just get married. Her older brother went to university. He may have been the first person in the family to go to university. But she decided she was going to teacher's training college, and she did, and became a school teacher around London, two different places around London, and then moved to Venezuela and became a teacher for Shell Oil, the expat kids, and was actually offered the headmistress in that job when she was 27, but she married my father instead. Now, one of my mother's grandchildren, one of her granddaughters, was told this story by my mother, the one I'm about to tell you. My mother, before she married my father, was engaged to another man. That sends existential chills down my spine. And her fiance had taken her to Bermuda, and they had gone there, and they did not have sex. Now, the modern person, the modern young folk, would not believe this story. But, and this is the important part, people who were raised in the 1930s and 40s had very specific rules about sex. You do not have sex before marriage, and you do not have sex outside of marriage. And this rule, by the way, my mother was not a Christian. My mother and my father would become evangelical Christians in the late 60s, early 1970s. But at this point, it was just the society, all of society thought this way. Now, of course, not all society, but the overwhelming majority. And if you say, but Mr. Horn, are you saying people didn't have sex? Of course they had sex outside of marriage. I'm just talking about what the rules say. Go back to Puritan America in the 1600s. Massachusetts, we believe that those early colonies had 30 to 40% premarital sex rates, looking at marriages and births. Of course, people don't read Canterbury Tales or Shakespeare for crying out loud. Come on, guys, people have been having sex outside of marriage. But there are still rules. So go to my mother now in 1950. Why does she follow this rule? Well, my mother's stubborn. That's one thing. But she's also idealistic. My mother idolized, I think, Queen Elizabeth. She heard her on the radio and found her story wonderful. And I don't know if you know her story. She fell in love with her soon-to-be husband when she was 13. Married him when she was 18. Prince Philip, if you've been watching The Crown, you know those stories. Okay, so all that's interesting, you say, Mr. Horn. Well, this is all interesting. Hold on. Imagine now, instead of being born in 1931, my mother was born in 1941. That's when the Beatles were born. What would her life have been like then if she had come to age in 1959, 1960, 1961? Even more interesting, let's leave the Beatles behind. Let's pretend that my mother was born as the first of the baby boomers. So in 1945, 1946, we'll see. Actually, there's going to be a new group of people we call the baby boomers, and they actually 1950s will be their big time. But if, let's say, you were born in 1945, 65, you'll be 20, so you go to college sometime in the 60s, the later 60s, what kind of experience would you have? It's these baby boomers who then give birth, let's say, to people sometime in the 70s or 80s. If you were to say you came to age in 65, 75, 85, let's say it's the baby boomers' children who were born in 85 to 90, who have very little understanding of rules. I think by the time we hit the 70s and 80s, the rules are all scrambled up, and now, of course, those children, what are their rules? Do we have rules? Now you say, well, of course we have rules. You can't have sex without consent, and yes, that is a rule. You can't have sex with your family members, yes, that's a rule. You can't have sex with children, yes, that's a rule. But are there any other rules? And the answer is no. So I thought, well, we should have some rules, and I've come up with some rules. So just see what you think about these rules. So, rule number 1. You can't have sex until you're 18 years old. And we'll have a big party, like a quinceañera, but of course you'll be 18. We'll have a big party. Your family and your friends will all gather around and help you find a sexual partner, and maybe you'll even be shown films. The young man will be shown a film pleasuring the female orgasm or something like that. And then we have this big party, and you can have a really nice first sexual experience. And then, rule number 2, you can only have 4 sexual partners before you have your first long-term monogamous relationship. We don't want you having lots of partners. And we want people in monogamous relationships, I think. Or maybe not. Maybe if you're going to have children, then you have to go on the monogamous relationship path. And we expect you to keep that monogamous relationship at least until the grandchildren are born. And otherwise, if you don't want to have children, you can do what you want. Here's the problem, though, of course, as people are shaking their heads at me. Of course, you can't have rules. You can't just make up rules. Even if they're smart rules, you can't just say these are the rules, because society doesn't work that way. We have to have traditions, and in fact, I'm going to argue, I think you have to have religion to make things really work. Maybe not. So we're going to go back in the next lecture and talk about the sexual revolution, because of course it doesn't all happen in 1950s and 60s. It's much earlier than that. But we'll talk about that next time.